I expect that we will see another large-scale Russian military mobilization following this declaration of war. We could see a very explosive escalation of the war. I think it would really put the fear of God in Zelensky, see a nuclear fireball above the Ukrainian presidential palace. I think the chances are pretty high. The Russians, they don't mess around. They are very focused on being able to fight and win a nuclear war. They believe since the 1960s that nuclear wars can be fought and won by the side that best prepares for them. And they're much more realistic and serious about fighting tactical nuclear war than the U.S. has ever been. The U.S. is completely vulnerable to a nuclear surprise, Pearl Harbor type surprise attack. The U.S. intelligence has been waging a disinformation warfare campaign against the American people, using hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians as cannon fodder and pushing us ever closer to the nuclear brink.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So we have back again Executive Vice President of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, David Pynes. He's a former U.S. Army Headquarters Staff Officer, a published national security strategist and military historian, and a Russia and nuclear weapons expert. And it's a great day to have him on, and a bad day to have him on at the same time. In the last 24 hours, Dmitry Peskov, the Russian press secretary, I believe, has basically said that what started off as a special military operation is now officially a war. And this comes just after Russia targeted a dam, the Dnieper Dam, as well as several power stations overnight. NATO is ready for a direct conflict with the Russian Federation. That's according to the NATO chief, Rob Bauer. And now the USA is telling Ukraine it's probably a good idea to back off those attacks on Russian oil refineries. Now, we initially planned to talk about what we usually talk about, which is the general strategic state of affairs. But what are your thoughts on the events of the last 24 hours? And we just recently got word that there's been a terrorist attack in Moscow, and apparently dozens injured, possibly dead, as well as the building that has been set alight and is now on fire. So what are your thoughts on all these developments?
Well, I think it's no coincidence that we have this perfect pretext for the Russian declaration of war in Ukraine. This type of thing has happened before, but this is a major development. This is something that Ukraine war watchers like myself have been looking for and expecting for some time. Russia has had it's framed the war in Ukraine as a NATO, essentially a defensive war, preventive war with NATO. It's increasingly been moving from a proxy, what I call Biden's proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, to a direct war. We've had all these reports come out about CIA bases, 12 CIA bases that were set up in 2014. Basically, every rationale that, with the exception of Nazis in Ukraine, that Putin has articulated, been proven factual over the past 2 years of revelations and declassified documents. So, I used to have a running argument with our late great executive director, Dr. Peter Pry, about how paranoid Russia really was about NATO, and he was absolutely right. He argued that they were very paranoid about NATO, and I was on the other side of the argument. But in fact, every one of Putin's paranoid fantasies about NATO have been proven true, as Biden has talked about, regime change against Putin, supporting. We have evidence that the CIA is not only supporting, but perhaps even picking the targets inside Russia for Ukrainian drone and missile strikes. So these are very alarming developments. I expect that we'll see another large scale Russian military mobilization following this declaration of war, as well as a major Russian offensive. Putin has proven, his strategic forbearance in the face of all these provocations has been nothing short of amazing. I would never have predicted it. But it appears his patience may be running thin. and we could see a very explosive escalation of the war, perhaps even including a Russian attacks to take out and disable U.S. and Western satellites that are directly helping Ukraine.
Yeah, as you said, the Russian strategic forbearance is very impressive because there's several times throughout the conflict where they could have reacted, and of course they would have been playing into potentially what NATO was devising for them, which would have been a trap, possibly in order to garner more support for the conflict. It's my impression that at this point in time, due to the slumping support for Ukraine, that NATO desperately needs some PR win. And we need something to galvanize NATO constituents towards the end of supporting a conflict, because right now there's very little support. And it's coming at a very bad time. And it seems as though the Russians are now just out of nowhere almost. Well, not really out of nowhere. The election was just won, I guess, if we put things in a timeline. But it does seem that they've definitely escalated things a notch. And when we started our conversation, the first thing you said to me was, this is the first day of World War III. And could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, so Russia has been fighting with what they have referred to as a special military operation. And in a special military operation, it essentially means that the war is being fought on Russian controlled or claimed territory. And so, Putin has clearly stated he believes Ukraine to be a natural part of Russia. He's willing to accept Ukrainian national independence as long as it stays out of NATO. So he'd be willing to, sign an armistice, for example, on the current line of control. But essentially, what he's been doing, he's been, as I've been stating over the past 2 years, he's been forcing the Russian military to fight with one hand tied behind its back. He's vetoed any, pleas from Russian generals to stage a major offensive. We haven't seen that really since I think about summer of 2022. I've been worrying of a potential Russian offensive that could materialize in the Kharkiv region, drive southwest towards the Dnipro, and then run along the river to surround Ukrainian forces in southeast Ukraine. He hasn't used a massive cyber attack. That's one of the things that I was most concerned about. And that could materialize any day. And, there's various weapons, unconventional weapons he could use to win the war in a single week. Super EMP weapons, a tactical nuclear weapon that could be used in EMP mode, exploded about a kilometer over Kyiv. It wouldn't kill almost anyone, but it would, would injure perhaps hundreds or thousands. And I think it would really put the fear of God in the Ukrainians and Zelensky to see that, to see a nuclear fireball above the Ukrainian presidential palace that, would show that, that would be the kind of demonstration attack, I think, that would really show NATO and Zelensky that Putin wasn't going to tolerate this proxy war against Russia any longer.
Recently, a German defense minister, and you talked about this in your article on your Substack, the most recent one that you wrote, they claim that Russia is going to invade another country in the next 18 months and that NATO needs to prepare for a potential conflict, or at the very least they were wargaming how this might play out. What do you think the prospect is right now of NATO troops entering into Ukraine? Of course, some people have already suspected that mercenaries have been present in Ukraine. I think it's beyond a suspicion. It's pretty much confirmed. But what about the actual troops being deployed into Ukraine under perhaps not the banner of NATO, but some sort of bilateral agreements between Ukraine and other countries? Do you think this is a possibility, and how do you think Russia is going to respond to this?
I do think it's a possibility. The UK was the first to raise this in a clandestine memo with other NATO countries that occurred in fall of last year, and they seemed very serious about it. They talked about the need that if there's a major Russian offensive, which had the had the risk of capturing Kyiv, that NATO should send in an expeditionary force consisting of tens of thousands of NATO troops to fight Russia directly and kind of man the Dnipro River line, to protect central and western Ukraine from being taken by Russian forces. Putin has clearly stated that that would be a nuclear red line, and that would expose NATO countries to direct nuclear strikes or minimally nuclear strikes on NATO troops inside of Ukraine. And I think that's a very credible argument. Russian nuclear doctrine has proven to have a much lower threshold than we previously realized, and that's something I think I addressed in this article as well. Essentially, as I reported last year, about a year ago, the risk of nuclear war was assessed by U.S. intelligence back in September of 2022 as having increased from 5% at the beginning of the war to 50% in September 2022. So there was a period of a few weeks where the Biden administration kind of went all hands on deck and did everything they could think of to try to dissuade Russian nuclear escalation against Ukraine that would have led to its very immediate capitulation.
We've heard all this talk about red lines, but it seems like the goalpost continues to be moved back. There was a time, I think, when we first had our first interview prior to Nord Stream, the thought of attacks on Russian soil were unthinkable at that time. The thought of attacks on Russia's nuclear bases, strategic bases, and their nuclear plants, and cross-border incursions, and attacks on Crimea and Black Sea Fleet, all of these things were considered red lines at one point. But even today, a member of the State Duma, it wasn't today, it was a couple days ago, had said that, well, if French troops enter into Ukraine, we will destroy them. But there was no threat of attacks on decision-making centers. So it appears as though maybe the goalpost is moving again. So what do we really make of these red line threats? Because it appears as though Russia is attempting to increase the threshold. You're saying that it was much lower than we previously thought it was, but it seems as though they're in an attempt to buy more time or try to avoid nuclear escalation. They continuously are moving the red line, which of course runs the risk of NATO forces exploiting that opportunity and viewing it as perhaps a bluff or a weakness, and then going even further, thus raising the stakes even higher. So what are your thoughts on these red lines, and is this really the final red line, like putting troops into Ukraine?
Well, I think it is. The whole point of Biden's war in Ukraine has been to really push all the way up to Russia's nuclear red line and then not cross it. And the threshold has always been for Russian nuclear use, that from the Biden viewpoint, has been the entry of U.S. troops and aircraft in direct combat against Russian forces in Ukraine. So I'm confident that they're not going to cross that. I think it's highly unlikely that Biden will cross that. I think Germany's not going to cross that line. The statements of the British, the French, and the Polish, that's something they are actively considering crossing, and that would expose their countries to enemy attack. But of course, I don't believe, what I'm trying to say is, I don't believe that there would be an immediate nuclear response from Russia to that. I think they would go up the escalation spiral, meaning that they would start with massive counterspace strikes to take out all our satellites. Then we would see probably a massive cyber attack on the U.S. and NATO that alone really could destroy and collapse all of our countries. And then if that wasn't sufficient, then they'd move to super EMP and attacks, and perhaps even a nuclear decapitation strike on Washington, D.C., which Russia, in all of their nuclear attack scenarios, they would execute at the very beginning of a nuclear conflict.
Because we would presume that if they were to put troops in, that there would be some level of air support in at least the western part of Ukraine, which we now know Poland is heavily militarized at this point in time, and that there would be some altercation over the skies, presumably between either NATO or Polish Air Force, because I think yesterday during that major attack on Ukraine, NATO forces were scrambled in response to that. So there was a possibility there of an altercation happening. What do you think about the deployment of F-16s and how they factor into this? Not necessarily in terms of whether or not they're going to be a game changer, but just in terms of the F-16 being a NATO aircraft and the accidents that can happen in terms of misattributing where that aircraft is originating from or things of that nature, because it seems like all these things are about to coincide. The possible entry of foreign troops officially into the conflict zone, plus the delivery of F-16s, plus this escalation into a full war. There's a lot going on here. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, I think if the introduction of F-16s into the conflict on the Ukrainian side is very concerning, because the F-16, of course, is a nuclear-capable aircraft. And that's really, in my estimation, early on in the war, back in March of 2022, I assessed that it was when Russia talked about disarming the Ukrainian military, what they were really wanting to do is to eliminate all of the potential nuclear capable strike weapons, which would include missiles, anti-ship missiles, fighter bombers, things of that nature. But the F-16 actually can carry the B-61 nuclear gravity bomb. And so, I think that would, as you said, introduce the possibility of greater escalation on the Russian side, because if they saw F-16s coming for their, nuclear bomber bases, for example, that Ukraine continues to attack, or their nuclear submarine and warship bases at their Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol, they could take that as a potential nuclear first strike. And as you said, it'd be hard to discern who's piloting the aircraft. As I've been discussing, I think since at least May of 2022, there's a high probability that many of the drone strikes have actually been undertaken with British and perhaps even American troops manning the drones. So these are direct strikes; these are acts of war against the Russian Federation, and we're very lucky as Americans and Canadians that we haven't seen the kind of massive direct response that, for example, America would have taken in response to such direct attacks by the Russian Federation against U.S. territory.
So would they be piloting these drones from Ukraine, or like what do you know about these drone strikes in terms of where they're originating from, the technology being used, how they're being guided?
Well, the large-scale drones, during the Iraq and Afghan wars, the pilots were actually manning the drones from half a world away in Las Vegas at Nellis Air Force Base in some instances. So it's very possible that the drones could be manned from Britain, for example, the Storm Shadow cruise missiles and whatnot. It doesn't necessitate NATO troops in Ukraine to man these types of drone attacks, and we know that Ukraine has used tens of thousands of drones. I'm not saying that most of those drones have been Western manned, but I think it's very possible that hundreds of them have been, particularly by the British, who's from the very beginning have seemed very trigger happy when it comes to World War III. Former British Prime Minister Liz Truss talked about. Before she even became prime minister, she was asked about whether she was ready to press the nuclear button. She said, absolutely. And there was no context. It wasn't like in the end, if Britain were, threatened with an existential threat, would you start a nuclear war that would destroy the world? She said, no, absolutely. I'm always happy to start a nuclear war with Russia that would destroy Britain and our NATO allies. So that's, I think, the mentality that we see in London, unfortunately, and thankfully we haven't quite seen that in the Biden administration, the White House, but it's veering in that direction, which is very disturbing.
And so these drones, these ones that have the exceptional long range, going all the way to St. Petersburg in some cases, are they using satellites to navigate, or how are they navigating?
Yes, yeah, they all are. They're GPS guided, they're satellite guided. So that's why I say that the first reaction of Russia to NATO troops crossing over into Ukraine would be a massive counter space attack that would take out our satellites. As exposed during the March 2023 Senate and House Armed Services Committee meetings with U.S. Intelligence and STRATCOM commanders. In any direct war between the U.S. and Russia and or China, we would lose access to all of our satellites within the first 2 hours of the war. So that would absolutely be the Russia's first strike against us.
So wouldn't they, in that case, take out their own satellites? Because I presume it's an indiscriminate weapon that would. You're talking about like an EMP, a space-based EMP, or are these targeted attacks on, like kinetic attacks on satellites?
So it'd be mostly cyber attacks. So cyber attacks obviously would easily differentiate between Western and Russian and Chinese satellites that could target Western GPS systems and Western satellites, while leaving Russian and Chinese satellites unharmed. As far as the super, I think we'll probably discuss that later, but that the threat of Russia or China using super EMP satellites to destroy their satellites, that won't be their prime mission. Their prime mission will be to destroy the U.S.
What is your take on the rhetoric about the weaponization of space as of late? I think when we were initially reconnected about a month and a half ago, that was kind of a hot topic in the news. There was concerns that Russia was going to be putting up a nuclear missile into space or something to that effect, nuclear weapon into space. And then just a week or so ago, I believe, they admitted that, in fact, they were going to be putting a nuclear power station into space. We have heard now that Elon Musk is going to be working with the U.S. Department of Defense Space Force in order to put these constant surveillance satellites into space. So we're seeing this rapid militarization of space. Can you tell us what your thoughts are specifically on this insinuation by the U.S. government that the Russians were going to be putting nuclear weapons in space?
Well, essentially, this is really old news because the Soviets put nuclear weapons in space in 1967, and U.S. intelligence was aware of it, and so we had them sign the Outer Space Treaty, which banned nuclear weapons to be stationed in space. We don't know whether they continue to have permanent nuclear weapons orbiting above the U.S. in space from 1967 on, but I think the chances are pretty high. I think the chances are pretty high that they've had almost a continual nuclear presence in space since that time. The Russians, they don't mess around. They are very focused on being able to fight and win a nuclear war, and that's meant primarily as a deterrent to the U.S. I mean, the U.S. views its nuclear deterrent as something that deters by its very existence at the strategic level. But we have kind of unveiled our hand that we have no intention of ever using it because we've degraded our we've destroyed 99% of our tactical nuclear arsenal. So now that we only have 150 obsolescent B-61 gravity bombs in NATO countries that would be destroyed in the first half hour of a Russian, even a non-strategic nuclear war with the Russian Federation. But we know that North Korea has had super EMP satellites orbiting above the U.S. since I think 2012 or 14. They have two. Iran also is believed to have two, based on my sources. I believe they're a nuclear power. They have been for several years. Perhaps as long as 20 years. They've had an ICBM program since 2005. There's absolutely zero rationale. There's no historical precedent for any non-nuclear country to have an ICBM program. And then of course, Russia, was exposed that these were in fact super EMP satellites, and it was wrong. I have a friend who's, Chet Nagel, who's a former senior CIA analyst, and he said that the leaks, like the New York Times story, smelled of CIA-controlled leak, which sought to kind of degrade the threat level, diminish the threat level, the perceived threat level by the U.S. public to avoid alarm. But he thinks that the super EMP satellites that the Russians either have already or are preparing to deploy on a moment's notice would primarily target the continental U.S. rather than satellites, because a super EMP satellite is, as you mentioned, is going to take out any insufficiently hardened satellite within line of sight. And that, I think we can safely assume most Russian and Chinese satellites are hardened against super EMP. But in the event they weren't, that would, potentially degrade their satellite systems as well. So that's obviously, more of a last resort type weapon. But then China as well, according to an Air Force report late last year, they of course have these, hypersonic glide vehicles, which allows them, they could essentially, park a nuclear weapon in space, either for a super EMP attack or for orbital nuclear bombardment. Fractional orbital bombardment system similar to what the Soviets first deployed in 1967 that the U.S. was so worried about. Supposedly, the Soviets withdrew their nukes in space in the mid 80s, but I remain skeptical about that.
So you think there are currently nuclear weapons in space, and that the New York Times article recently published was for the purpose of potentially minimizing the threat?
Yeah, I think it was a CIA disinformation campaign. Sad part is the sad reality that we face is that U.S. intelligence has been waging a disinformation warfare campaign against the American people for many years. Certainly about the war in Ukraine. Everything about 80% of what we hear on liberal news networks, even Fox News in some cases, about the war in Ukraine is pretty much disinformation, trying to show that Ukraine is winning the war, Russia's losing. Everything possible to justify the Biden regime policy of this perpetual war against Russia and Ukraine, using hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians as cannon fodder and pushing us ever more closer to the nuclear brink of war with Russia.
Recently, Vladimir Putin had been speaking with some of his heads of state and basically saying something along the lines of, what is the progress on the nuclear power station in space? So do you believe that they're trying to build a nuclear power station in space? What purpose would that serve? Or is this just a cover for the deployment of nuclear weapons in space, or the already existing?
Yeah, it's definitely a cover. Russia obviously, engages in disinformation warfare campaigns against us as well. Russia has previously deployed nuclear-powered satellites in space during the Soviet times. They may or may not still have them, but a Russian nuclear-powered satellite poses little to no risk to the U.S. It would be a super EMP or a FOBS type orbital nuclear strike weapon that would pose an existential threat to the United States.
I've heard about these directed energy weapons and their ability to potentially neutralize like hypersonic weapon systems. Do you think that could be deployed in space? Could this be part of the reason why they're deploying these? Because, of course, you need a lot of energy in order to do this. I mean, this is Star Wars stuff. But do you think that could be a possibility as to why they're potentially for interceptive purposes?
Yeah, we know that China has space-based lasers in space. I would assess that Russia likely does as well. But before it was leaked that these were super EMP weapons, satellites, I assessed that based on the reports, it sounded as if the Russians were developing X-ray lasers, which would be, essentially lasers that were powered by nuclear detonation that could take out multiple satellites or multiple nuclear missiles at the same time. So I think at this point, based on the intel that I've seen, it's unlikely that Russia has X-ray lasers in space. I think super EP are much more plausible, and it's obviously Those are off-the-shelf weapons that have existed in the Russian arsenal since the 1990s. Easily deployable. The Avant-Garde, for example, uh, I guess Satan II missile, the new monster ICBM that Russia's deployed, the Sarmat, can carry at least reportedly 24 Avant-Garde nuclear hypersonic glide vehicles. Any one of those could be equipped with super EMP weapons, or they could be used in the FOBs mode to rain nuclear attacks on the U.S., including Washington, D.C.
So, since we started talking a couple years ago, obviously the situation has escalated a lot since then. And again, going back to the issue of red lines, what is the potential utility of a nuclear weapon currently in the conflict zone aside EMP? Because we know now Russia is going to be mass producing the Fab 3000 bomb, which has a very high blast yield and probably the equivalent of a very small sub-kiloton nuclear weapon. What do you think the potential use case is, and how do you see, if at all possible, how do you see nuclear weapons presenting themselves first, either on the battlefield or, as you've previously stated, of course, as a use of an EMP to potentially neutralize the power grid in Kiev or in some part of the battle theater? But of course, that would have a lot of negative repercussions and make Russia even a greater pariah in the minds of the international community than it already is. So what do you think the first feasible, plausible use of a nuclear weapon looks like? And does it even have any utility, really, tactically speaking?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that point out that Russia has a 35-1 advantage in terms of non-strategic nuclear weapons. They have 5,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons. The U.S. has 150. China has at least hundreds of non-strategic nuclear weapons deployed alongside Taiwan and Japan. And the U.S. has no nuclear weapons, no non-strategic nuclear weapons in the Pacific, aside from perhaps 4 to 16 deployed on our Trident II nuclear missile submarines, which, if they were used, China would take that as a nuclear first strike and engage in their own nuclear first strike against the U.S. But in terms of battlefield utility, Russia, these nuclear weapons actually do have substantial battlefield utility. You can take out entire regiments of troops, perhaps even brigades, if they're concentrated enough. Thousands of enemy soldiers with a single, 1 kiloton weapon. Russia has 2,500 tactical nuclear weapons, which are 1 kiloton to 50 kiloton yields. Then they have another 2,500, which are sub-kiloton weapons, which were exposed by Dr. Peter Pry and subsequently by Rebecca Koffler, who's a former DI analyst. And those weapons emit zero radiation, or rather zero fallout. So they could be used. Russia, in other words, Russian forces could annihilate an enemy regiment or brigade. They could wheel around, the blast zone with at little risk to themselves. So they could blow holes in the Ukrainian lines, rush armored forces through, and envelop the whatever troops that are have survived that were immobilized perhaps by the EMP effects.
So these sub-kiloton nuclear weapons, I mean, seeing some of the explosions we have in Ukraine, I mean, some of these look like nuclear explosions. Obviously, they're not preceded by the bright flash, so we know they're not. But can you explain a little bit about how that works, how you can have a nuclear weapon with no radiation? And then the question arises, we know that the U.S. has installed radiation detectors across Ukraine. That was, I think, over a year ago now that I first heard about that story. So it begs the question, if Russia used a nuke, would we even know? Because, of course, the Ukrainians are very guarded with respect to what they show. And in fact, it's illegal to show a lot of the direct hits on any asset in Ukraine. It's you can't post anything or else you go to jail. So this is interesting to me because this is a lesser known fact, and I think it'd be great if you could expound upon that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about Russian nuclear weapons that have a yield of 100 tons TNT equivalent. I mean that gets, as you said, almost within conventional weapon range. Where the U.S. Moab, I can't remember if it's 16-ton equivalent or 25-ton equivalent, but a Moab, for example, utilizes thermobaric warhead, which, according to some people, essentially have an explosive effect of 8 times larger than their actual explosive yield in terms of TNT equivalent. So, as you mentioned, the U.S. deployed special, I think it's KC-135 modified aircraft that are essentially nuclear sniffer aircrafts that can detect smaller amount levels of radiation from a nuclear blast. They deployed those in March 2022, and then since we deployed sensing stations so that we even know that Russia has crossed the nuclear threshold. So that's how usable, I guess, Russian nukes really are, because that we might not even know that they've been used for sure. We could see a blast that they could potentially even deny that it was a nuclear weapon and just said they used a massive thermobaric bomb against Ukraine. So that's a really good question to ask.
And so, how does it work that there's no fallout? I don't understand that.
So I'm not a technical expert with regards to these types of nuclear weapons as Dr. Peter Pry was, but because there is typically fallout in every ground burst and near ground, some even not near ground bursts in the case of a large size or large yield nuclear weapon. But I mean, this has been verified, they produce zero fallout. So they're quite useful in a nuclear battlefield environment. During the Cold War, the U.S. had 7,200 nuclear weapons deployed in Western Europe at the height of the Cold War. And we knew the Russians were, their standard battle plan was to use tactical nukes to blast holes through enemy lines, and they were trained to operate in nuclear environments. But they would have had difficulties because at that point, they're with the tactical nukes that they had at the time, they weren't advanced, and they did produce fallout. So the fact that Russia has produced these much smaller subkiloton weapons that produce no fallout that are optimized for battlefield use indicates that they're much more realistic and serious about fighting a tactical nuclear war than the U.S. has ever been.
Yeah, and this really confounds the nuclear escalation ladder when you have a potential weapon being utilized that's not technically radioactive. And it begs the question, well, is it the radiation that is going to cause the run up the escalation ladder, or is it just the destruction and the potential explosive yield that you get from such a small weapon that is in such great amounts that is the concern? We know that the Russians are preparing to fight a nuclear war, and maybe perhaps we're more ill-equipped than we've let on. Can you talk a little bit about how, and you go into this in your most recent article about their rehearsal of the use of tactical nuclear weapons. We know that they've been getting their population prepared mentally and physically in terms of CBRN preparation. How do you think we compare to the Russians in terms of our readiness to fight an actual nuclear war?
Well, first, let me correct a statement that I corrected earlier on in the interview previously. All nuclear weapons do produce radiation. So these are nuclear weapons that would still produce radiation, but they would not produce nuclear fallout.
Oh, okay.
So you just wanted to correct that. But In terms of readiness, I mean, there's just no comparison. Russia is the most ready of any country in the world to fight and win a nuclear war. They believe since the 1960s that in terms of their political and military leadership, that nuclear wars can be fought and won by the side that best prepares for them. And they were able to achieve parity with the U.S. in terms of nuclear weapons in 1972 and superiority in the 80s. And they never lost that superiority. They ended the Cold War with twice as many nuclear weapons exactly as the U.S. had, with 44,000 nukes and only 22,000 for the U.S. And we didn't realize that they had that many nukes. We assumed they only had 30,000. But in terms of nuclear war preparations, as I mentioned in the article, they are producing new nuclear war simulators to train their troops to fight nuclear environments. They have a massive network of blast shelters. Their subways are deep underground that would be provide blast shelters for 40% of the Russian population, most of which is concentrated in European Russia. They have a underground rail line that's deep underground that travels from Moscow to Yamantau Mountain and their other, I think it's Kavinsky Mountain, which is their alternate nuclear command center. And these are underground cities that are the size of the Washington, D.C. Beltway region. So that can house 30,000 Russian leaders and their families. So we have nothing compared to that. And they're buried under 3,000 feet of granite. So the U.S., the closest we have to that is our old, strategic command headquarters at Cheyenne Mountain. It's that, we believe could survive a direct hit by a low yield nuclear weapon, but definitely not from a high yield nuclear weapon as the Russians would likely use to destroy it. And so, when Tulsi Gabbard and folks like that talk about, well, the Western elites, think they could survive a nuclear war because they have blast shelters. They don't have the blast shelters they need to survive, nuclear strikes. Russia does. China does. China has their national operations center northwest of Beijing. That's 2,500 feet underground. That's their main nuclear command center. I just read an article today which was talked about a recent report on Chinese nuclear command and control, which stated they have two alternate command centers as well. They also have China has their underground Great Wall, which has 3,000 miles of rail tunnels, both to in terms of survival bunkers, as well as mobile, ICBMs that are stored, hundreds of mobile ICBMs that we don't even count in their nuclear arsenal. So, unfortunately, Russia and China would likely survive a full nuclear exchange. Certainly, if they were able to take out our most of our nuclear arsenal in a nuclear first strike. Where it would only take, I think, 9 warheads, according to a recent U.S. 4-star general, to take out 50% of actually 52% of our active nuclear warheads and our operational ones, and then 80% of our total nuclear warheads.
And that would be because of the EMP effect?
No, that would be due to the nuclear blast effect. We have 2 nuclear missile submarine bases at Bangor in Washington and Kings Bay in Georgia. We also have 3 nuclear bomber bases, and then we have 4 nuclear weapons storage facilities where all of our deactivated, partially dismantled nuclear weapons are stored.
So, I've had a couple bunker experts on the channel recently, and I think we all suspect that perhaps the U.S. has a lot more than they're letting on, because of course these would be top secret facilities, so we'd have to presume that, or at least we'd hope anyways, that they put a little bit of that black budget into making some backup plans. What do you think about the prospect of a Cheyenne Mountain 2.0 or a Raven Rock 2.0 somewhere tucked in the Colorado mountains perhaps?
I think the chances are pretty low. U.S. official policy has been to leave the U.S. naked against nuclear missile attack. Our own, Stratcom commander has stated that it's against actually, it's our Northcom commander that stated that it's official U.S. policy not to defend against Russian or Chinese nuclear missile attack. Russia and China have no such policy. Their policy is to, take down as many Russian and Chinese nuclear or as many incoming U.S. nuclear RVs as possible. And so we've had this mentality since the ABM Treaty was signed in 1972 that, we actually had a national missile defense system. It was called the Safeguard System, and it was activated, I think, early in 75. I mean, we actually had, national missile defenses prior to that, but it was deactivated that same year by Congress. We've seen that the willful vulnerability mentality extended to super EMP weapons. We have no defense against those. Only we have limited air defenses and limited cyber defense capabilities. So I would be surprised to hear, to believe that we have some kind of top secret Cheyenne Mountain type survivable bunkers for U.S. leaders. I think you're right. I think we likely do have classified bunkers, despite the fact that most of our Cold War era bunkers have been kind of left abandoned. Essentially, we certainly likely have others somewhere else. None of those would be able to survive a direct hit, but certainly if Russia and China weren't aware of their locations, they could potentially ride out a nuclear war.
Yeah, I agree with you that we're definitely ill-prepared from a anti-ballistic missile or even to fight the nuclear war itself. But I am skeptical of the idea that they wouldn't have made some preparations for themselves because, let's face it, our leaders are pretty selfish. And, we come from a culture where it's very individualistic. And whereas in Russia and China, where they make space for millions of people in their population, I think that the idea that they wouldn't make some contingency plan for themselves, at the expense of the American taxpayer is quite unlikely. But okay, so in terms of, I guess, is there anything else, like with respect to the recent article that you wrote, that you feel it's important for people to be aware of? There's a lot of different places we could go here in terms of the article that you wrote, but I think we've covered some stuff. Is there anything else, with respect to strategic and policy as it pertains to what's going on in Ukraine?
Well, I just wanted to say that, as I point out in my article, NATO is, the Biden administration and NATO have essentially, created their own Russian threat. Russia wasn't really much of a threat in terms of intentions. Obviously, capabilities, they always have the ability to destroy the U.S. and NATO for the entire time since the Cold War ended. But in terms of intention, Putin had no intention to attack NATO, conventionally speaking, or otherwise. Just contingency plans, in case NATO attacked Russia first. But the more that we escalate our war, undeclared war against Russia and Ukraine, the greater the chance that a nuclear World War III could materialize with Russia, and that's supposedly the exact threat that NATO was created to deter. In fact, NATO has provoked a potential nuclear war with Russia. So I think that's an important point for your viewers to realize. I also talked about the possibility of a nuclear decapitation strike, and particularly the usefulness of super EMP weapons to potentially take out America's nuclear C2 or NC2 system, which is our nuclear command and control, without which we can't even launch a nuclear response. So, for example, if Russia or China were to take out DC with a nuclear bomb with mere minutes warning, with the President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris in DC, they could potentially take out all three nuclear footballs in one blow, meaning we couldn't regain launch control of our nuclear arsenal for a matter of days. And so there would be days where, Russia and China could just leisurely take out our nuclear arsenal, take out, Stratcom, Offutt Air Force Base, take out the Pentagon and various launch control facilities across the U.S., including Hawaii and Puerto Rico. So I don't think people realize how vulnerable we are to that type of nuclear strike, where where perhaps only a few, perhaps a dozen nuclear weapons would be utilized, as was recently discussed following Putin's threat to nuke the U.S. During his February 29th presidential address.
So if those nuclear footballs were taken out, who possesses those? Biden and other two?
Yeah, so the nuclear footballs, there's one at the White House at all times. Then there's one that goes with the president and one that goes with the vice president. So, if the president, vice president are on travel, there's only one nuclear football in D.C. But in a DEFCON 4 or 5 situation, there's no requirement, from a nuclear alert status perspective, to have the president and vice president separated or, an undisclosed location, which is why that I've been arguing for the last 2 years that we need to increase our DEFCON status to permanently to DEFCON 3. Russia and China essentially have the equivalent of DEFCON 3 as their lowest nuclear readiness run, where they're ready. They have full readiness status, alert status for every leg of their nuclear arsenal. Certainly, that's the case with Russia. I believe it to be the case with China as well, given their recent massive nuclear buildup. So we need to match that level of readiness. And I don't think, some people have stated that, that might be a provocative move, but I think if we combine that with attempts to de-escalate the conflicts over Taiwan and Ukraine diplomatically, that Russia and China would respect that as a show of strength that isn't overly threatening to themselves.
So what happens if, do the generals have any autonomy to fire nuclear missiles, or do they have to wait? Is there any policy that, if all the footballs are taken out, what do the guys who are manning the nuclear submarines do?
They have no fire authority whatsoever. It was the late 1990s that President Clinton removed their independent nuclear firing capabilities. So during the Cold War, it was only U.S. nuclear missile submarine commanders that had nuclear firing authority. If they, there was, it was kind of a checklist that if they were unable to reestablish communications with, the U.S., even, servicing to a, periscope level or linking up with some kind of sonar buoy, then they potentially had the authority to fire themselves. So they don't have any independent launch authority. There's no one except for the president of the United States that has that authority. Obviously, if the president, vice president were killed, there would be a new president that was be sworn in. Then they would inherit that firing authority. But there's no general, for example, the Secretary of Defense, the vice president, or a general cannot launch without presidential authority.
Okay, so there's no backup plan if the president and the vice president are taken out?
There is a backup plan. It's top secret. I don't have access to it. I have a friend who helped devise the nuclear football, or rather the instructions that go on with it that are currently used today. And he said there is a backup plan, but it could take days to materialize. So there is a way to reroute launch control, but it wouldn't be readily accessible, in terms of within the same day.
Well, and we would presume that the president and the vice president would have forewarning that there was a nuclear attack impending, unless there was some, satellite-based hypersonic nuke, orbital reentry vehicle, or whatever you refer to in your article. In terms of DEFCON, what DEFCON do you really think we're at right now? Because it seems that, since the Chinese balloon incident, there's been a lot more military activity. And it could just be that people are paying more attention to it now. There's a lot of flight radar OSINT enthusiasts on Twitter and numerous other social media platforms that perhaps are amplifying what's actually occurring. Do you think that we're actually in a higher state of readiness in response to everything that's going on, or is it basically just the baseline?
So we actually, during the whole of 2022, we remained at DEFCON 5, despite, multiple very credible Russian nuclear alerts or escalations in their alert status. It was repeatedly stated by the Biden national security officials that they saw no reason for us to increase our nuclear alert status. And then I have sources where I was able to confirm what our actual nuclear alert status was and whether it had been escalated. And the answer was no. The Biden administration is the most anti-nuclear administration president that we've ever seen. I think he fully intended to massively decrease the size of our nuclear arsenal if the war in Ukraine hadn't materialized. And obviously, once that happened, he wasn't able to, he lacked the political capital to be able to make that happen.
In terms of the DEFCON, so DEFCON is one of these enigmas. We're at a different DEFCON level than Europe, I presume. Like DEFCON is kind of a fluid thing. It's not like one DEFCON level for the entire planet, or is it like continent by continent? Is there like depending on the different command districts, like, there's CENTCOM, and is that how it's broken down, or can you maybe explain a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah, you're right. So when I talk about DEFCON, the Defense Conditions System alert system is based on it's per command. So I'm always whenever I mention that, I'm referring to U.S. Strategic Command and U.S. Northern Command. But as you stated, there's other commands. There's European Command. There's evidence to suggest the alert level for European Command since the war began has been heightened. I don't know if that would be the equivalent of DEFCON 4, DEFCON 3. But it's our nuclear deterrent, which has remained at DEFCON 5. There's been, some signs or possibility that it could have been escalated to DEFCON 4 briefly since 2022. I don't know if that's the case or not. But essentially what DEFCON 5 means is that the U.S. is completely vulnerable to a nuclear surprise, Pearl Harbor type surprise attack. It's like the equivalent of lining up your planes in a row. So, Chinese, fighters and bombers can destroy them with ease. And so that's why it's so important to have DEFCON 3, because if you go to DEFCON 3, it means that our nuclear bombers will be deployed on 24-hour strip alert. It means that the president and the vice president will never be able to be co-located in the same area, same city rather. They have to be different places so that the enemy would have to launch at least 2 nukes to take them out. And that's the kind of message we need to send to Russia and China that we're not going to be completely vulnerable to a nuclear surprise attack.
Well, what about though, because, we're seeing these deployments of F-35s, and we're seeing a lot of firsts. Like I think the B-2 bomber, first time it went to a certain part of Europe this year. We're seeing the moving of nuclear weapons back to a base in the UK. We're seeing training in Poland. Polish pilots are training on the F-35s to deploy nuclear weapons. And we are seeing movement, we're seeing changes in the nuclear doctrine. So I know you're describing what appears to be a paucity of interest in the nuclear issue, but there does seem to be movement along these lines, particularly in Europe. What do you know about their strategy? Because it almost starts to look like, maybe their one last ditch Hail Mary might be some sort of decapitation strike using F-35s and a combination of just everything at once on Russia? Do you think that that's a possibility, that they could potentially have that as a plan?
Yeah, I think there's no possibility, no realistic possibility of a U.S. nuclear first strike against Russia. That's never really been part of our doctrine. Of course, we have what's called our nuclear umbrella over our allies, at least in theory. However, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara both stated, according to Dr. John Mearsheimer, one of the most preeminent foreign policy realists, that it was a bluff, essentially, that if Russia had used nukes on West Germany, for example, during their invasion, if the Cold War had gone hot and they penetrated through the Fulda Gap, we would not have responded in kind. We likely would have tried to de-escalate the conflict. And because Biden really is the most anti-nuclear president we've ever had, there's just no possibility, certainly with him as president, that where we would engage in nuclear first use. I think Russia could essentially nuke our allies, and I don't think Biden would respond in kind. It's that grave in terms of how anti-nuclear he is.
When you say Biden is anti-nuclear, what do you really mean by that? Because are you saying that Biden is a good guy and he doesn't like nuclear weapons? Or are you saying that is this something that is really Biden that's in control of? Because he's only been in power for 4 years So what level of control and sway does he have over the program itself? Obviously, he inherited a deficient nuclear program. But when you say that Biden is anti-nuclear, what do you really mean by that? Because is Trump pro-nuclear? Just to try to get a sense of.
Yeah. So, the difference between Biden and Trump is not in their willingness to fight nuclear wars. Although I'd argue Trump is much more averse to fighting a nuclear war than Biden is. It's the difference is, Biden supports decreasing the size of our nuclear arsenal unilaterally, whereas Trump has said he would like to increase it massively, and that's that's really what we need. We need to have a much larger nuclear arsenal to deter nuclear war. If we had fought the Cold War, like we have today with a nuclear arsenal that's 5 times or 6 times less the size, smaller than Russia's and China's combined, we probably would have lost that war, and the Soviets likely would have won it. As it was, we were outmatched to some extent, but not massively, as is the case today. There was still a rough balance of terror, and some degree of nuclear parity, which we've completely lost because we haven't. We're operating with the nuclear arsenal that was built in the 1970s. For the most part, that's half a century old, whereas Russia's and China's have all been modernized within the last 15 to 20 years, and in some cases much more recently than that.
And you talk about how, and we've talked about this in the past, and the late Peter Pry mentioned this as well, the prospect of a decapitation strike in the other direction is something you believe more likely. And do you think that is something to do with Russia's policy of nuclear war being something that is in fact winnable? I know you've talked about this in the past. I've heard conflicting views on this. Some people saying that, a lot of the people who are in the pro-Russia camp saying that no, Russia will never use nuclear weapons. They don't believe a nuclear war is winnable. But we also know that oftentimes what Russia says is not in line with what Russia does. Case in point, the invasion itself was never supposed to happen. They were turning those tanks around, and then the next day they were invading the country. So what is your thoughts on the strategic culture in Russia? Do you still think they genuinely believe they can win a nuclear war? And under what circumstances would they initiate such a thing? Because it seems right now they're, for all intents and purposes, winning. Ostensibly, they're on the offensive, and there's no real risk that their existence is under threat. So right now we can presume maybe that the prospect for them wanting to leverage that option is low. But can you maybe just expand a bit on that idea that they believe a nuclear war is winnable?
Yeah, I mean, as I stated, that they have optimized their nuclear force posture, as well as in terms of having 35 times more non-strategic nuclear weapons than we have. I mean, that's kind of, most analysts believe that if a nuclear war began, it wouldn't be a bolt out of the blue. It wouldn't be a strategic first strike. It wouldn't be a nuclear decapitation strike. It would most likely be, as you've suggested, the use of a few battlefield nuclear weapons to blow holes in Ukrainian lines, or in the instance of war with NATO, to blow holes in Polish or Romanian lines. So I think that in terms of the nuclear threshold or red line, Crimea has often been talked about as a nuclear red line. I think it's almost universally agreed among U.S. national security policy circles that if Ukraine were succeeding in recapturing much of Crimea, that would be an absolute nuclear trigger. Graham Allison, former Assistant Secretary of State to Defense to Bill Clinton, estimated it'd be a 75% chance, or as high as 90% chance of Russian nuclear escalation if that were to occur. We saw the 50% escalation possibility during the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives by Ukraine in September and October of 2022. So those are the type of situations where Russian territory is being overrun, even Russian annexed territory in Ukraine are being overrun, that Russia would use nuclear weapons. So I agree with you that the chances of as long as NATO doesn't intervene in Ukraine, I think the chances of a Russian nuclear escalation will remain low.
Okay, so quickly, a question about nuclear testing. I think one of the most plausible scenarios is that if there was going to be a nuclear flex, it would come in the form of some nuclear test. What do you think now that I think there was a nuclear testing treaty that just expired? What is the likelihood of a nuclear test happening either in China, Russia, or the United States?
Well, as Dr. Peter Pry assessed, the Russian and Chinese likely never stopped underground nuclear testing. There've been seismic events that are unexplained in Russia, China, and North Korea that likely very possibly could have been nuclear testing, and it's just unreasonable for us to believe that they would have had this like a 3-decade moratorium on nuclear testing as we've done, because there's few things more stupid that we could have done than that. In fact, we're currently designing a new nuclear warhead, and we're planning on putting it in active duty service without even testing it. And without testing it, we don't even know if it would work. But you're right. Russia did announce that it was breaking out of the nuclear test ban treaty, and that applies to underground testing. So they've essentially told us that they are beginning underground nuclear testing. Actually, one of their nuclear underground test sites is being readied. We have every indication that they're preparing to, do a public and formal nuclear test, and that likely will occur early this year.
Okay, so I just want to get your thoughts on what you think is coming next. What are your projections for how this war is going to play out in Ukraine in the coming months ahead? What do you think we can expect to see? Well,
what I would expect to see is a major Russian escalation in the form of a Russian offensive. They've tripled the size of their army since the war began. Their active duty army. They have about 250,000 or 300,000 troops in the Kharkiv region, Belgorod region, facing Ukraine that could be used for such an offensive. They also, of course, have their 450,000 troops inside of Ukraine, and so I am predicting that there will be a summer offensive that we'll see, certainly with this declaration of war, that could mobilize several 100,000 additional troops, or at least a few 100,000 additional troops. aside the Kharkiv region that they could use for a major Russian offensive that could retake control of much of eastern Ukraine, primarily southeast Ukraine, multiple oblasts, potentially even use those to cross the Dnipro to threaten Kyiv itself, and would likely deploy. We'd likely see Russian move to redeploy a large force in Belarus, which to minimally just tie down Ukrainian troops in the north while they're undergoing this offensive. I think the risk of Russian attacks on Western satellites is certainly heightened. The risks of Russian cyber attacks are greatly increased as well, because as I mentioned earlier in the interview, with the end of the special military operation and the transition to a full scale war, Putin is essentially taking the gloves off the Russian military and is now able to within Russian doctrine, within their legal framework, to attack, NATO targets directly, but likely with cyber attacks, but potentially with kinetic attacks as well, or sabotage attacks. So I think, I think the fireworks are going to start. When I said at the beginning of the interview that this was the first day of World War III, I was exaggerating, of course. I don't think it's World War III. There's a lot of people that mistakenly claim that World War III has actually begun already. But we'll know when World War III begins, because World War III will be fought right here in the U.S. Because in the first sign of the war beginning will be the power goes off permanently, in a war with Russia and China, because I'm predicting that once we start a direct war with Russia or China, it'll be just within the first few days, perhaps even the very first day, that they'll stage a massive cyber attack that will, turn off the power and electricity throughout the country.
Yeah, there's rumors right now that the purpose of these NATO troops, or not NATO troops, less than NATO troops going into Ukraine, are going to bolster the lines in the north along the Belarusian border, and that's going to free up Ukrainian troops to better defend what's about to happen in the east. Because right now in that Belgorod region, you have no fortifications. And you have to ask yourself, well, why is there no, fortifications in that region yet, in and around Graveron and Belgorod? And of course, that would be the pathway that the Russians might take to encircle Kharkov. So you think that that's what's going to happen then in the next?
I do, yeah. Kharkiv, of course, is the second largest city in Ukraine. Russia, did have some abortive attacks against it early in the war in 2022, but it was just today that they turned the lights off in Kharkiv. They had a major missile attack with like 16 missiles that took out Kharkiv's main power facilities. So that, the rationale to do that, for me, would be kind of a precursor to a major offensive in the Kharkiv region.
And I know you have to get going right away, but you also recently wrote an article about the China October surprise. Can you just give me the elevator pitch for what you think is about to go down in China? We know that currently you have U.S. Special Forces right off the coast of China in the Kinmen Islands. What do you think is going to take shape there in the months to come?
Well, yeah, there's been credible sources that have stated that China is planning to blockade Taiwan in the October timeframe. This would likely occur a few days after the celebrations of the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. That's accompanied by military parades, a massive military parade in Beijing. And I've been saying for several years now that Xi Jinping has set a goal of 2025 to complete forcible, peaceful or forcible reunification of Taiwan. So I think that's likely to materialize. It's going to be, shortly before the U.S. presidential election. If they already major Chinese cyber attacks on the U.S., Biden could potentially use that as a pretext to definitely postpone the presidential election, which would be a dictatorial move that we've seen with Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine. But I think that the the purpose of the Chinese blockade would be really to cut off all U.S. assistance to Taiwan, isolated, be accompanied by a massive cyber attack. If Biden were to intervene, or we got in some kind of shooting war, that was even happened accidentally, it could quickly escalate to a massive counter space and cyber attack on the U.S. that could collapse the country, and perhaps even worse with super EMP weapons. I think China's objective continues to be to prepare for war with the U.S. While hoping that saner heads will prevail, and Biden actually won't follow through in his threat to defend Taiwan militarily, which he stated he would 4 times. I think the risks of a full scale war with China are very high later this year. I think that the number of troops that China has mobilized over the past 2 years are completely unnecessary for an offensive against Taiwan. They could have easily taken it without mobilizing any additional troops. I think it's an indication warning that Xi is providing, that he plans to either engage in invasions and occupations of U.S. allies in the region, including Japan, the Philippines, possibly even the U.S. and Australia. So I think that should be a further deterrent, that the U.S. should provide strategic clarity that the U.S. will not defend Taiwan militarily to avoid a potential nuclear war with Beijing.
Yeah, we know that's very unlikely to happen, unfortunately. How many troops has China mobilized in the last 2 years?
There haven't been any good reports in open source for us to know. I would estimate it's several 100,000. They started, they had 2.2 million troops before the mobilization that began in April or May of 2022. So it's likely several 100,000 that they mobilized. I would estimate the size of their active duty military to be around 3 million right now.
And so on your Substack, you often, at the end of your articles, you propose various solutions, and you are very solution focused in your writing. I know we didn't get a chance to talk about a lot of those solutions and proposals today. Obviously, you're working with people to try to get some of those, get some eyeballs on those solutions. Where can people go to learn more about what you do? I know we're going to link your Substack. Do you still utilize your YouTube channel, or is there other places where people can get access to your information?
Yeah, I still utilize my YouTube channel. I put all my YouTube videos and interviews there. Unfortunately, about half of my interviews are non-YouTube, Rumble and various other locations. So they aren't all gathered together in one location, but I do have, I think, 50 plus interviews there. I also, my Substack, the Real War Substack, is my main source, or a place where people can go to read my latest national security analysis and warnings. That's at dpyne.substack.com. Once again, dpyne.substack.com. And by the way, my Substack is recommended by Dr. John Mearsheimer. It's appears as number 2 out of 17 Substacks he recommends. So
he's a pretty smart guy. So that's
he's a loyal reader, and obviously I'm a loyal reader of his, and he's much more prominent than I am.
Have you interviewed him on your channel yet?
No, so I haven't really started. I've had grand plans to start my own podcast, and I just really haven't done it. But he would be the top of potential interviewees if I get that going.
Well, I encourage people to go and check it out. You're being a lot more prolific lately, I've noticed, with the Substacks, and it seems like every other week you're doing a new, very extensive write-up. The most recent one, I believe it was like a 48-minute read, but it's not, it's all very densely packed information, stuff that you're not going to hear anywhere else, guys. So be sure to go and check that out. And I look forward to that interview with Mearsheimer because, unfortunately, that guy's on the kill list, so he might not make it too long if Zelensky has his way. So I guess we'll see how things work out.
He's on the Ukraine kill list?
I think so, yeah. I think he was on the supposed kill list, right?
Yeah, so I'm on the blacklist, but not on the kill list. I had never heard that Mearsheimer was
You
on
haven't
either
made
list.
the kill list yet?
I have no intention of making the kill list. I'm happy to be on the blacklist.
You got to work harder, man.
Yeah, Colonel McGregor is on the kill list, so he's got me beat on that front.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks a lot for coming out, buddy. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks again. Have a great day.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.